Breathe gently as we begin our quiet journey south of the Egyptian sands, to a land often whispered about but rarely understood, the ancient realm of Nubia. Here, along the endless flow of the Nile, kingdoms rise and fade, their voices softened by time and by the rhythm of the river. Tonight, as you drift toward rest, we will walk the banks of that eternal current and listen to what the stones, temples, and tombs of Nubia have to tell us. The story of Nubia is the story of resilience, of a civilization that grew in the narrow valleys of the Nile between the first and sixth cataracts, a region that glows under the African sun. It is a place of gold and granite, of towering cliffs that shimmer like bronze, and of people whose presence stretches far beyond their portrayal as Egypt's southern neighbor. While Egypt became known as the land of pyramids and pharaohs, Nubia was the land of kings just as mighty, and queens whose thrones were carved from silence and sand. Archaeologists call this area ancient Kush, though over thousands of years it bore many names, Taseti meaning land of the bow, after the archers who became legendary throughout the Nile Valley, and later, Napata and Meroë, great capitals that shaped centuries of history. In the soft murmur of this story, we find that Nubia was not a shadow of Egypt, but a mirror, one that reflected back the brilliance, the belief, and the endurance of African civilization. The early Nubians controlled the trade routes of ivory, incense, ebony, and gold. Their lands connected Central Africa to the Mediterranean world, their boats moving with the slow heartbeat of the Nile. As the stars appeared over the desert, life in ancient Nubia unfolded with a measured rhythm. Villages clustered close to the water, surrounded by date palms and the occasional cry of herons. The air carried the scent of silt and reeds. Men tended to herds of cattle, their horns long and arched. Women wove baskets and ground grain on smooth stones. Children learned to swim in the shallows of the Nile. Nubia's earliest cultures, such as the A group and C group people, left behind delicate pottery, jewelry made from carnelian and gold, and burial sites that reveal a society proud of its identity. Even before Egypt rose to greatness, Nubia was crafting a world defined by balance, between the harsh desert and the nurturing river, between power and peace. As you settle deeper into relaxation, imagine the river under a moonlit sky, its surface like black glass, whispering past cliffs of sandstone. Somewhere in that darkness, the earliest kings of Nubia dream of their place among the stars. They do not yet know that their descendants will one day rule both Nubia and Egypt, standing atop one of the greatest thrones in human history. Let your breath match the flow of the Nile, steady, gentle, ancient. The story begins. The roots of Nubian civilization stretch back over 7,000 years, into a time when the desert had not yet fully claimed the surrounding lands. The people who settled here were drawn to the Nile's gifts, water, fertile soil, and fish, but they also brought with them skills from older African traditions. These early inhabitants learned to farm sorghum and millet, to herd cattle, and to fashion stone tools with precision. Archaeologists divide these early Nubians into groups based on the artifacts they left behind. The A group, flourishing between 3800 and 3100 BCE, created an organized society along the Nile's banks. Their graves, rich with pottery and beads, show a community of traders and farmers, not isolated but deeply connected to their environment. Some of the earliest evidence of kingship in the Nile Valley appears in their burials, a hint that the concept of divine rulership may have had deep southern roots. Further north, Egypt was beginning to unify under its early dynasties. The two regions interacted often, sharing goods, styles, and beliefs. The A group traded gold, incense, and exotic animal skins with Egypt, while importing Egyptian linen and tools. But as Egypt grew stronger, it began to see Nubia as both a partner and a prize. Around 2900 BCE, the A group culture mysteriously vanished, likely overwhelmed by Egyptian expansion. For several centuries, little is known about the people who lived in Nubia. Yet beneath the silence, life continued. Small communities endured, adapting to new realities, preserving traditions in secret. By 2000 BCE, a new society emerged, the C group. These people, perhaps descended from earlier Nubians, left behind bright red and black pottery and circular stone tombs. They lived in peace with Egypt for a time, but the balance of power soon shifted again. The Egyptian pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom saw Nubia as a source of gold and soldiers. They built fortresses deep into Nubian territory, great walled structures like Buhin and Semna, standing guard over the river. Inside these fortresses, Egyptian soldiers lived far from home, staring out across the desert that seemed to stretch into eternity. Yet even as Egypt imposed its will, the culture of Nubia endured, blending and transforming. Egyptian gods found new homes here, merged with local deities. Worship of Ammonius, the hidden god, took root. Art began to show mixed influences. Nubian jewelry shaped by Egyptian technique, Egyptian hieroglyphs carved beside African motifs. In time, as Egypt's control weakened, a new Nubian kingdom rose from the shadows. It was centered at Kerma, near the Third Cataract, a city of mud brick temples, wide courtyards, and a towering structure known as the Defufa. The Kerma culture became one of the earliest urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa, thriving between 2500 and 1500 BCE. Kerma's kings were powerful, their rule marked by wealth and artistry. They traded far into Africa, acquiring ivory, gold, and exotic animals. Their craftsmen shaped bronze weapons and fine ceramics of red and black. Their tombs, ringed by hundreds of sacrificed cattle, spoke of reverence and authority. Egyptian texts called the kings of Kerma rulers of vile Kush, yet in truth the Egyptians both feared and respected them. At its height, Kerma challenged Egyptian power, its armies clashing with pharaohs on the borders. Eventually Egypt conquered Kerma under Thutmose I, but the cultural memory of Nubian kingship endured. And as you drift deeper into this story, the hum of ancient trade echoes softly, the movement of boats, the murmur of languages lost to time. The foundation of Nubia's greatness had been laid. After the fall of Kerma, Nubia entered a period of Egyptian rule that lasted centuries. The Egyptians established temples to their gods, built towns, and mined Nubian gold. Yet, beneath the surface of this occupation, the spirit of Nubia endured, waiting for its moment to rise again. That moment came around 1100 BCE as Egypt weakened. The new kingdom collapsed into chaos, and in the south, a new Nubian power began to form, the kingdom of Kush. Centered first at Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, this kingdom saw itself as both Nubian and heir to Egypt's legacy. Napata became a place of faith and ceremony. The wind whispered through the sandstone cliffs, carrying the scent of incense from temples dedicated to Ammonius. Here, Kushite kings rebuilt shrines, adopted hieroglyphic writing, and styled themselves as true pharaohs. Among these rulers rose one of the most remarkable dynasties in African history, the 25th dynasty of Egypt, also known as the Nubian dynasty. Around 750 BCE, King Pi, a wise and devout leader, set out from Napata to reunify Egypt. His conquest was not one of destruction, but of restoration. He claimed to bring back Ma'at, the divine order. Pi's inscriptions still survive, describing his campaign with both humility and authority. When he entered conquered cities, he purified himself in the Nile, offered sacrifices to Ammonius, and forgave those who submitted. To his people he was not merely a conqueror, he was a restorer of balance. His successors, Shabaka, Shabikku, and Taharka, continued his vision. Under King Taharka, the Nubian Empire stretched from the Mediterranean to deep within Africa. He built temples and pyramids, sponsored art, and revived Egypt's ancient traditions. In Thebes, priests chanted his name. In Napata, he ruled beneath the desert stars. Yet even great empires are mortal. Assyrian invasions pushed the Kushite pharaohs from Egypt around 650 BCE. They retreated south, not in defeat but in transformation. Napata remained sacred, but new power began to center further down the Nile, at Meroë. As you sink deeper into rest, imagine the flicker of torches in Napata's temples, shadows of priests moving through stone corridors. A civilization was shifting its heart, not losing it. The thrones of Nubia would remain silent, but not empty. At Meroë, the kingdom of Kush entered its golden age. The city lay between the 5th and 6th cataracts, where the Nile split into fertile plains. Here the Nubians built a capital unlike any other, one that blended African vitality with Egyptian form and Mediterranean influence. The people of Meroë were blacksmiths, merchants, scribes, and nobles. Their city rang with the rhythm of hammers shaping iron, for Meroë was a center of iron production, so much that Greek writers called it the Birmingham of Africa. Columns of smoke rose into the bright sky as artisans forged weapons, tools, and ornaments. The pyramids of Meroë, smaller but more numerous than those of Egypt, dotted the desert hills. Over 200 still stand today, their steep sides pointing sharply toward the heavens. Inside, kings and queens were buried with treasures, gold jewelry, furniture, and amulets carved with symbols of eternal life. One of the most striking features of Meroitic culture was the prominence of women. The Candake, or Queen Mother, held immense power. Some ruled outright, commanding armies and negotiating with foreign empires. One Candake, Amanirenas, famously resisted Roman invasion around 25 BCE, forcing the empire of Augustus to sign peace with Nubia on equal terms. The Meroitic language developed its own script, the first written language of sub-Saharan Africa. Though only partially deciphered, it reveals a people deeply literate and proud of their identity. The art of Meroë depicts graceful figures, elephants, and divine symbols. Temples rose in honor of Ammonius, Apidmak the lion god, and Isis. Trade routes linked Meroë to the Red Sea and beyond. Ivory, leopard skins, and ostrich feathers moved north, while glass, wine, and scrolls came south. Caravans crossed deserts under the steady rhythm of the sun. As centuries passed, Meroë remained a beacon of African civilization. Its scholars studied astronomy, its priests observed the heavens. Yet beneath this golden peace, slow changes began to stir. Trade routes shifted, climate grew harsher, and rival powers emerged to the east and west. Still, for nearly 1,000 years, the thrones of Meroë endured in quiet majesty, their rulers reigning from palaces of sun-baked brick, their memory preserved in the whisper of the desert wind. In the heart of Nubia, as the centuries unfold under the relentless desert sun, a quiet transformation begins to take shape. Power, once defined by conquest and kingship, finds a new expression through women, the Candakes, the queens of Kush. These women stand at the summit of Nubian civilization, their authority unquestioned, their thrones glimmering beneath a golden sky. While the ancient world often concealed its women in shadows, the kingdom of Kush placed them at the center of governance, faith, and diplomacy. This chapter belongs to them, the rulers who guided a nation through its golden age, and whose legacies continue to shimmer across the sands of time. The word Candake or Candace in the writings of the Greeks and Romans was more than a title. It was a lineage, a sacred designation. In the Meroitic tradition, the Candake could be the queen mother, the consort, or the sovereign herself. Her role was rooted in both divine symbolism and practical authority. The Kushites believed that their rulers were chosen by the gods, especially Ammonius and Apidmak, the lion-headed deity who represented strength and protection. The queen, therefore, was not merely the mother of kings but the vessel of the kingdom's spiritual essence. Among the most renowned of these rulers was Queen Amanirenas, who reigned in the late 1st century BCE. Her name, meaning she who is immortal, still resonates with quiet dignity. When the Roman Empire expanded under Augustus, it sought to extend its reach into Nubia. The Romans invaded, burning towns and occupying the northern frontier. But Amanirenas refused submission. She assembled an army of warriors, men and women alike, and led them into battle herself. With her son, Prince Akinadad, she struck against the Roman garrisons, reclaiming territory and burning the fortress at Syene, near the modern Aswan. The Roman historians who recorded these events, though writing from the other side, could not conceal their admiration. They described her as brave, one-eyed, and unyielding. In their accounts, she becomes almost mythic, a queen who rode into battle against one of the most powerful empires of her time and emerged undefeated. Eventually, a peace treaty was negotiated. It granted Nubia favorable terms and recognized its sovereignty. Amanirenas had defended her people not through endless war, but through measured strength. The treaty held for decades, a rare equilibrium in an age of conquest. The Kandakes who followed continued to rule with similar wisdom and might. Queen Amenishikito, whose reign began shortly after Amenirina's, left behind a legacy of grandeur. Her pyramid at Meroë, rich with treasures, was one of the most splendid of the entire kingdom. Jewelry of gold and enamel, amulets carved with deities, and intricately designed scepters reflected not only her wealth but her spiritual stature. Her reign marked a high point of Meroitic culture, when art and architecture reached exquisite refinement. The image of the Kandake became a symbol of divine balance. In temple carvings, she is depicted larger than her male attendants, holding a ceremonial bow or offering gifts to the gods. The scenes show her standing before a Piedmac, sometimes with a lion at her side, a guardian spirit of strength. The symbolism is unmistakable. The queen embodies both nurture and authority, the earth and the flame. The balance between feminine and masculine power in Kushite governance was not a novelty but an ancient continuity, one deeply rooted in African cosmology. Beyond politics and religion, the Kandakes influenced the rhythm of everyday life. Under their reigns, Meroë prospered as a cultural crossroads. Craftsmen worked bronze and gold into shapes inspired by both local and foreign styles. Artisans painted scenes of ritual and harvest on the walls of homes. Scribes recorded trade agreements, laws, and hymns in the elegant script of the Meroitic alphabet. The people of Meroë believed that the prosperity of the land was tied to the virtue of their queen. Festivals celebrated her, musicians composed songs in her honor, and priests invoked her name during ceremonies of renewal. Trade flourished across the empire during this period. Caravans carried Nubian goods, gold, ivory, ostrich feathers and iron tools, north to Egypt and across the desert to the Red Sea ports. From there, ships carried these treasures to Arabia, India, and beyond. In return, Meroë welcomed merchants from Greece and Rome, whose languages and customs mingled with the native ones. Yet even with this openness, the people of Kush remained distinct, their identity shaped by a deep reverence for their land and ancestors. In the quiet hours of evening, the city of Meroë glowed under the fading light. The pyramids stood as watchful silhouettes against the horizon, their sharp angles softened by centuries of wind. In the palaces, the Kandake would preside over councils, listening to the reports of generals and traders. Her voice, calm but resolute, determined the course of nations. She might order new temples built or dispatch envoys to neighboring lands. The governance of Meroë under the Kandakes was guided by principle rather than pride, by the sense that the ruler was both guardian and servant of her people. The spiritual life of the kingdom also deepened during their reigns. Temples dedicated to Ammonius and Isis thrived, their priests conducting elaborate rituals of renewal and thanksgiving. The lion god Piedmac became particularly beloved in this era, representing courage and the guardianship of the realm. His temples, such as the one at Naka, still stand in remarkable condition. Their walls show scenes of the Kandake standing beside Piedmac, both figures holding bows, both radiant with divine strength. These images remind us that, in Meroitic thought, kingship and queenship were sacred trusts, reflections of cosmic harmony rather than personal ambition. As centuries passed, the succession of queens continued, though their names gradually blurred into the silence of time. Their pyramids multiplied across the desert, smaller than those of Egypt, yet more numerous, rising in clusters that glimmer under the moon. Inside, hieroglyphs and Meroitic inscriptions describe the queen's virtues, their lineage, their offerings to the gods. The bodies within were adorned with jewels, wrapped carefully in linen, surrounded by amulets shaped like lotus flowers and ankhs. Each burial was a statement of eternity, that the Kandake would continue to guide her people even in death. Today, when archaeologists uncover these resting places, they find fragments of color still clinging to the walls, blues, reds, and golds that once illuminated sacred stories. Every artifact recovered from these tombs adds another voice to the chorus of history, a quiet confirmation that women once ruled one of the greatest civilizations on the African continent. Their leadership defied the limitations placed on them by surrounding empires, proving that strength and compassion could coexist, and that wisdom was not confined by gender or geography. As the night deepens in our story, Picture the golden sand surrounding the pyramids of Meroë. The air is still, the stars are sharp and brilliant. Somewhere among those pyramids lies the memory of the Kandakes, rulers of grace and power, guardians of a civilization that thrived in balance with the rhythms of the river and the pulse of the earth. Their thrones, though silent now, still shimmer in the imagination of those who listen closely enough to the desert's whisper. And as we drift onward through time, their legacy remains, a quiet, enduring reminder that leadership can take many forms, and that even in silence the thrones of Nubia speak. The golden era of Nubia, the age of the Kandakes, the bustling trade routes and the flourishing city of Meroë, begins in time to soften into twilight. Every civilization, no matter how radiant, must eventually yield to the turning of the ages. And so it is with Meroë, the last great capital of Kush. The story of its decline is not one of sudden catastrophe, but of slow transformation, of rivers changing course, of forests thinning, of silence growing where once the clang of iron filled the air. In its prime, Meroë stood as a hub of trade and metallurgy, a beacon of wealth and culture in the heart of Africa. Its people mastered iron production to an extent unparalleled in the ancient world. Archaeologists have uncovered vast mounds of blackened slag, the remnants of smelting furnaces that once roared with heat. For centuries, this mastery gave Meroë great strength, providing tools for agriculture and weapons for defense. But over time, the very industry that sustained the kingdom began to consume its own foundation. The iron furnaces demanded charcoal and the charcoal demanded trees. As forests disappeared, the land around the city grew barren, and the soil lost its vitality. Trade too began to shift. The routes that had once brought wealth from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea grew uncertain. The rise of the Roman Empire changed the commercial map of the world. New centers of exchange emerged, and caravans that once passed through Meroë found easier or safer paths elsewhere. Even the Nile itself seemed to alter its patterns, its floods less predictable, its waters carrying less silt to renew the fields. The balance that had nourished Kush for centuries was slowly unraveling. Within the kingdom, internal divisions may have deepened. Nobles and priests competed for influence, and regional governors asserted their independence. The inscriptions of later kings are fewer, shorter, less confident. The temples still echoed with prayers, but their maintenance declined. Statues of the gods stood in shadow, their altars receiving fewer offerings. Even so, the people endured, continuing the rituals of their ancestors. They still prayed to Ammonius and Epidmac, still buried their dead in pyramids, still spoke the language of their forebears, though even that language was beginning to change. The Meroitic script, so proudly developed centuries earlier, had by now become a mystery even to many of its own people. Few could read its signs or interpret its sacred texts. The knowledge of writing, once a symbol of authority and continuity, faded into the silence of oral tradition. Language, like water, finds new courses. It flows through the generations, reshaping itself while carrying echoes of what was lost. And then came the shadow from the east, the rising power of the kingdom of Aksum, centered in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Aksumites were traders, sailors, and builders of stone monuments that rivaled those of Kush. They controlled the routes to the Red Sea and maintained contact with Arabia and India. Over time, their influence expanded westward toward the Nile. Tensions between Kush and Aksum grew, perhaps over trade or territory, and eventually conflict became inevitable. Around the middle of the 4th century CE, the Aksumite king Ezana, a ruler newly converted to Christianity, recorded a campaign against Kush. His inscriptions describe a victory, the capture of cities, and the subjugation of the Kushites. Whether this represents a single decisive invasion or the culmination of longer decline is uncertain. But by the end of that century, Meroë was no longer the living heart of a kingdom. Its palaces stood empty. The furnaces had gone cold. The pyramids remained, as they always had, silent witnesses to the passage of time. Yet to imagine this as a moment of final extinction would be to misunderstand Nubia's nature. Civilizations do not vanish, they transform. The fall of Meroë gave birth to new societies along the Nile. The people of Nubia did not disappear, They adapted, intermarried, and continued their lives in the valleys and oases their ancestors had tamed. The Kushite legacy flowed into the Christian kingdoms that would later rise, Nubia, Makuria, and Alodia, and into the cultural patterns that shaped the region for centuries to come. The pyramids of Meroë, though abandoned, remained sacred. Travelers who passed through the desert sometimes camped among them, lighting fires that flickered against the stones. The wind moved through their narrow corridors, whispering like the breath of the past. Beneath layers of drifting sand, the kings and queens of Nubia rested, their treasures sealed away, their names still faintly visible in painted glyphs. For more than 1,000 years they slept beneath the stars. The medieval Arab geographers who heard rumors of these ruins could not agree on their origins. Some said they were the tombs of forgotten giants. Others believed they had been built by ancient sorcerers. It would not be until the modern era that their true identity would be rediscovered. When European explorers and archaeologists arrived in the 19th century, they found themselves humbled by the scale and sophistication of the remains. What they had expected to be an echo of Egypt turned out to be a civilization in its own right, an African power that had ruled empires, forged iron, and shaped art and architecture to rival any in the ancient world. Today we know that the Nubians of Kush developed a unique vision of kingship and community. Their temples stood not as copies of Egyptian design but as expressions of their own cosmology. Their art portrayed faces with strong African features, adorned with elaborate jewelry and headdresses. Their gods, Ammonius, Isis, Apidmak, reflected both borrowed and original elements, harmonized into something distinctly their own. Theirs was a world built on synthesis and survival. The echoes of Meroë can still be felt in modern Sudan and along the Nubian Nile. The people of these lands remember their ancestors not as relics, but as part of a living continuum. The songs, rhythms, and crafts of Nubia carry whispers of that long past. The pattern of woven baskets, the curve of pottery, the cadence of local dialects all trace back to Kushite roots. The pyramids of Meroë remain, their sharp angles breaking the horizon like silent sentinels of eternity. As the stars rise above them, the same constellations that once guided ancient travelers return each night. Orion still stands over the desert, and the Milky Way still drifts above the Nile. The land endures, and so too does the memory of those who shaped it. The thrones of Nubia may be silent, but their silence is not emptiness. It is the stillness of continuity, the pause between one era and another. Let your mind rest now, wandering gently across those dunes. Imagine the coolness of the night air, the soft hiss of the wind over sand. The fires of Meroë are gone, but the warmth of their light lingers, in the earth, in the river, in the rhythm of human history itself. Civilization, like sleep, is never final. It is a cycle, a dream renewed. As the centuries pass, the sands of time gather gently over the memories of Nubia, yet they never bury them completely. Beneath the surface of the modern world, the spirit of this ancient land continues to pulse quietly, in the rhythm of the Nile, in the art and architecture of Africa, and in the enduring story of resilience written into human history. Nubia may have fallen from empire to memory, but its essence lingers, vast and luminous, like a constellation that remains visible long after its stars have burned out. The rediscovery of Nubia begins not in temples or tombs, but in curiosity, the same curiosity that once drove the early travelers along the Nile. During the 19th century, European explorers and scholars arrived in what is now Sudan, following the river southward from Egypt. They expected to find remnants of a once subordinate culture, but instead, they encountered evidence of a civilization that had flourished independently, with its own language, deities, and aesthetics. The pyramids of Meroë rose from the desert like mirages, smaller and steeper than those of Giza, yet astonishingly numerous. Over 200 stood clustered together, their capstones pointing toward the heavens. Archaeologists such as Giuseppe Ferlini and George Reisner unearthed the treasures and tombs of the Kushite kings and queens. Unfortunately, their methods were often crude. Curiosity was mixed with destruction. Many pyramids were broken open, their inner chambers disturbed in search of gold. Yet even in ruin they preserved an unmistakable dignity. The painted walls, the fragments of hieroglyphs, and the carved reliefs spoke in a language older than memory, one of order, divinity, and beauty. Modern research has since illuminated more of Nubia's achievements. Linguists continue to study the Meroitic script, that graceful and still partly undeciphered writing system that once conveyed prayers, decrees, and poetry. Each sign on the sandstone stele represents not only a sound, but a lost world of thought. Archaeologists now recognize that Nubia was not a mere extension of Egypt but an equal partner in shaping the ancient African world. The exchange of art, religion, and politics between these two neighbors was fluid, at times cooperative, at times competitive, but always mutually influential. Today, as one travels along the Nile through northern Sudan, traces of that legacy remain visible. The outlines of ancient temples rise above the desert, and villages nearby still bear names that echo the Kushite tongue. The people of modern Nubia, many of whom were displaced during the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, retain a strong cultural identity rooted in their ancestral land. Their music, language, and oral traditions keep alive the essence of an ancient worldview, one that valued harmony between people, river, and sky. In Nubian songs, one can still hear the rhythm of oars on the Nile and the whisper of palm trees swaying under a moonlit sky. The melodies flow like water, winding and unhurried, much like the civilization that gave them birth. Their themes are universal: longing, memory, love, and endurance, yet their tone is unmistakably Nubian, filled with the serene acceptance of time's passing. In these quiet cadences, the old kings and queens seem to dream again, their spirits humming softly through the generations. The world's understanding of Nubia continues to deepen as new discoveries are made. Satellite imaging has revealed ancient roads, settlements, and forgotten pyramids buried beneath the sands. Excavations in places like El Kuru, Nuri, and Gebel Barkal uncover not just artifacts but entire ways of life, systems of governance, trade, and belief that rival any of antiquity's more famous civilizations. Each discovery reminds us that Africa's story is older and more intricate than once believed. The influence of Nubia extends far beyond its borders. The artistic motifs of the Kushite period, the lotus and the falcon, the sun disk and the crescent, appear in designs throughout the African continent. Their architecture inspired later traditions of stone building, while their metallurgy and craftsmanship spread through trade networks that reached deep into sub-Saharan Africa. Even the concept of divine kingship, so central to Kushite rule, resonates in later African monarchies that blended spiritual and temporal authority. The Nubian legacy also invites a profound reflection on cultural continuity. Though the kingdom fell, its people did not vanish, they adapted to changing circumstances. The Christian Nubian kingdoms that rose in the medieval era carried forward many Kushite traditions under new symbols. The cross replaced the ankh, yet the architecture of their churches bore the same symmetry and geometric grace seen in earlier temples. Frescoes from ancient Nubian cathedrals depict saints with dark, expressive faces and ornate garments, unmistakably African, yet universal in their serenity. In more recent centuries, Nubia has become a symbol of endurance and identity for the people of Sudan and Egypt. Artists and historians, poets and educators have drawn upon its imagery to express pride in African heritage. Museums around the world now display Nubian artifacts with a new respect, not as curiosities from the margins of Egypt, but as masterpieces from a civilization in its own right. The sandstone lions, the delicately carved amulets, the regal portraits of candaces remind visitors that power can be graceful, that knowledge can be quiet, and that greatness often grows in the spaces between empires. The quiet grandeur of Nubia also offers lessons for the modern world. Its history reminds us that all civilizations, no matter how advanced, depend upon balance. Balance with nature, with neighbors, and with the unseen forces that shape destiny. The story of Meroë's decline is not merely a tale of loss. It is a cautionary reflection on overuse of resources and the fragility of ecological harmony. The exhaustion of forests, the silting of the Nile, the shift in trade routes, all are echoes of challenges humanity continues to face. Yet, in understanding Nubia's fate, we also glimpse hope, the ability to rebuild, to preserve memory, and to transform loss into wisdom. Even as you listen now, drifting gently toward rest, imagine the Nile under starlight, the same eternal river that nourished Nubia's fields and carried its boats. Picture its waters glimmering in the moonlight, flowing past silent ruins and across centuries. The air is warm but calm, and the horizon glows faintly with the promise of dawn. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a reed flute carries across the desert. It is a song that has no beginning and no end, the song of continuity. The pyramids of Meroë remain, and they continue to watch the world change. Modern travelers who stand before them often describe a sense of timelessness, a feeling that the ancient kings still guard the desert, that the past and present merge in the still air. Their silhouettes against the morning sun remind us that beauty and impermanence can coexist. The desert wind erases footprints, yet the pyramids endure, their sharp edges softened only by the patience of centuries. When the archaeologists leave and night returns, the desert cools once more. The stars shimmer above the ruins, each one a spark of ancient fire. The Milky Way stretches like a bridge between ages, linking the world of the living with that of memory. In that moment, the legacy of Nubia is not confined to history books or museums. It lives in the silence, in the vastness, in the shared heartbeat of all who have ever gazed at the Nile and felt the pull of eternity. So, as we come to the end of this journey through time, let the spirit of Nubia rest gently in your mind. Its story is one of creation and endurance, of harmony and renewal. It reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, but their essence, their quiet conquest over oblivion, remains. The river still flows, the desert still dreams, and somewhere in the eternal hush between the stars, the voices of Nubia continue to whisper their lullaby of history. Drift now peacefully into sleep. Let the rhythm of the Nile carry you. The story of ancient Nubia does not end. It only pauses, waiting to be dreamed again. As dawn breaks over the desert once more, we return to the timeless rhythm of the Nile, the river that never ceases to flow, even when empires fade into dust. In this quiet light, the story of Nubia takes on a new shape, neither past nor present, but something in between, a reawakening of memory, culture, and pride. The civilization that once ruled between the first and sixth cataracts of the Nile still lives, not only in the stones of its temples or the sands that cradle its pyramids, but in the spirit of its descendants who walk those same riverbanks today. The reawakening of Nubia is not a single event but a gradual unfolding, like the petals of a lotus rising from the Nile at dawn. It begins with rediscovery, with the recognition that Nubia's story was never truly lost, only quieted. For centuries, the great empires of the world cast long shadows over the African continent, and in those shadows the brilliance of Nubia was dimmed. But the silence was never emptiness, it was the waiting breath of history. In the 20th century, as the modern nations of Egypt and Sudan took shape, the ancient land of Nubia once again came into focus. Archaeologists, historians, and local people joined hands to unearth the story of a civilization that had ruled in gold and granite, that had stood tall against Egypt and Rome alike. Excavations at Napata and Meroë revealed not only the splendor of a bygone kingdom but the remarkable continuity of life along the Nile. The pottery, the musical instruments, the textiles, and even the agricultural patterns spoke of endurance, a thread unbroken through thousands of years. Yet the reawakening of Nubia was not without sorrow. In the 1960s, when the Aswan High Dam was constructed to control the flooding of the Nile, its rising waters created Lake Nasser, a vast artificial lake that submerged much of Lower Nubia, the homeland of countless villages and archaeological treasures. Ancient temples, tombs, and settlements lay in the path of the flood. For the Nubian people, it was both a moment of loss and rebirth. They were displaced from ancestral lands that had been their homes since time immemorial, resettled in new regions far from the river that had defined their identity. But even as the waters rose, an extraordinary act of preservation unfolded. The world came together in one of the largest archaeological rescue operations ever undertaken, the UNESCO Nubian Salvage Campaign. Teams of engineers and archaeologists from around the globe dismantled and relocated dozens of temples block by block. The magnificent temples of Abu Simbel and Philae were saved, lifted high above the flood and rebuilt stone by stone in safer places. These acts of preservation were not merely technical achievements. They were gestures of reverence, acknowledgments that Nubia's legacy belonged not just to one nation but to all humanity. For the modern Nubian people, the displacement became a symbol of resilience. In their new homes they carried with them their songs, their stories, and their distinct language known as Nubian. Through oral tradition, they kept alive the tales of their ancestors, of kings who ruled with justice, of queens who defied empires, of a river that gave life to everything it touched. The rhythms of Nubian music, played on the kisar harp or the tar drum, still echo the pulse of the ancient Nile. Their art, rich in color and geometry, reflects the harmony of the natural world, a style that traces its lineage back to the walls of Napata and Meroë. As scholars delved deeper into the past, a new understanding emerged. Nubia was no longer seen as a peripheral culture overshadowed by Egypt but as an origin point of power, innovation, and beauty. The Black Pharaohs, the Kushite rulers of Egypt's 25th dynasty, were re-examined not as foreign usurpers, but as rightful heirs to the ancient Nile tradition. Their reign, once minimized, is now celebrated for its unifying vision and its contributions to art, architecture, and spiritual life. In universities, museums, and documentaries around the world, Nubia is once again spoken of in tones of admiration and wonder. In Sudan, the preservation of Nubia has become a national and cultural mission. The pyramids of Meroë have been restored and protected as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Festivals celebrating Nubian heritage bring together music, dance, and storytelling, bridging the gap between the ancient and the modern. Artists reinterpret the old symbols, the sun disk, the falcon, the lion-headed god Apidmak, in murals and sculptures that link the past to the present. To walk through Khartoum's museums today is to see Nubia not as a memory, but as a living presence, woven into the very fabric of identity. The reawakening also lives in the digital age. Young Nubians share images of their ancestors' pyramids online, tell the stories of the Kandakes in podcasts and videos, and write poetry inspired by the sands of their homeland. Each act of remembrance is a quiet resistance to forgetting, a renewal of connection between generations. The desert, once thought to be silent, is speaking again through the voices of those who descend from its ancient people. To understand Nubia's reawakening is to recognize that history is not a straight line but a circle. The kingdom that once rose along the Nile did not simply vanish, it folded into the lives of those who followed. It became language, music, memory, and myth. And now, in an era of rediscovery, it rises once more, not in conquest but in consciousness. As night falls again over the pyramids of Meroë, their silhouettes shimmer beneath the stars, the same constellations that guided travelers and priests millennia ago. The wind brushes across the desert, carrying whispers of both the past and the present. Somewhere, a Nubian family sings an old song to a child falling asleep, a melody passed down through unbroken centuries. In that moment, history and humanity are one. Close your eyes and imagine the river's gentle current, the starlight glinting on its surface. The pyramids stand like eternal sentinels, watching over the rebirth of their story. The ancient kingdom sleeps, but it dreams, and in its dream the people of Nubia walk once more among the temples, their laughter mingling with the soft breath of the wind. The reawakening is complete, not as an empire of stone, but as an empire of memory, enduring, tranquil, and eternal. The night deepens over the Nile and the air grows cool. The stars shimmer softly, reflected in the slow-moving water. Along its banks, the whisper of reeds sways in rhythm with the current. In this stillness, we begin to sense something timeless, a truth that transcends dynasties and monuments, a truth that has lingered through ages, that Nubia's story is not merely a chapter in history, but a living current that continues to flow like the river itself. From the cataracts in the south to the fertile delta in the north, the Nile has been the thread that stitched together the lives, beliefs, and dreams of countless generations. To the people of ancient Nubia, the river was not just water, it was spirit. It was the source of birth, the path to eternity, and the mirror of the gods. In their temples, the Nile was carved into myth and stone. It was said to emerge from the underworld, carrying the essence of life from the unseen realms. The floods were a heartbeat, the pulse of a divine body that sustained both kingdoms and peasants alike. As we drift deeper into this quiet reflection, imagine a Nubian village thousands of years ago, where the day ends in the glow of oil lamps and the scent of burning incense. The people sit outside their mud brick homes, their laughter carried on the breeze. A pot of millet stew simmers over the fire, children chase one another by the edge of the fields, elders tell stories of kings and gods, of journeys to the stars. These stories, told softly beneath the same constellations that gleam tonight, were the lifeblood of Nubia's identity. The priests of Ammonius at Gebel Barkal, that sacred mountain which rose above Napata like a finger pointing to heaven, believed that their land was chosen by the divine. The mountain's profile was seen as the shape of a cobra's crown, the emblem of kingship. Here, the priests crowned the rulers of Kush, declaring that Ammonius himself had placed them upon the throne. To rule in Nubia was not merely to govern but to maintain harmony with the cosmos. Each law, each offering, each ritual was a thread woven into that greater balance between heaven and earth. When the floods came, the people celebrated. They thanked Happy, the spirit of the Nile, whose waters brought renewal. The fields turned green, and herds grazed upon fresh grass. Traders returned to the roads, bringing ivory, gold, and incense. For a moment, everything aligned, the rhythm of life in perfect balance. Even centuries later, in quieter times, when the kingdoms had waned and the temples fell into shadow, the people still felt the river's rhythm in their bones. To them, time was not a straight path but a circle. The same stars that guided the farmer's planting also marked the soul's journey through the afterlife. Life flowed into death, and death into rebirth, as naturally as the Nile's seasonal rise and fall. The tombs of the Kushite kings at Nuri and El Kuru were built to reflect this eternal return. Their corridors aligned with celestial patterns, ensuring that the dead might travel easily among the stars. The walls were painted in rich hues, deep blues for the heavens, reds for life, golds for the divine. To enter such a tomb was to step into a cosmos contained within stone. As centuries passed and kingdoms changed, the river remained the keeper of memory. It bore witness to conquest and peace, to the laughter of children and the prayers of priests. When the temples of Ammonius grew silent, the people still came to the riverbank to honor their ancestors. They placed offerings of bread and beer upon the water, whispering the names of those who came before them. To remember was to keep the world in balance. In modern times, the Nile continues to connect the living to that ancient rhythm. Along its banks, fishermen cast their nets as they have for thousands of years, their songs echoing over the water. The sun still rises with the same golden brilliance that once illuminated the faces of the pyramids. The language may have changed, the gods may have faded from worship, but the relationship between people and river endures unchanged, a quiet covenant renewed with every dawn. The legacy of the Nubian kings is not merely carved into stone but imprinted on the human spirit. Their story teaches that power can coexist with beauty, that endurance is a form of wisdom, and that silence itself can speak. The pyramids of Meroë and Napata may stand in ruins, yet they still possess a presence so profound that even the desert seems to pause around them. In their narrow chambers lie the echoes of hymns, of drums, of whispered prayers to the sun. Each grain of sand carries the weight of 1,000 untold stories. As we reflect on those kings and queens, the Kandakes who ruled with majesty, the warrior priests who guarded the sacred mountain, the craftsmen who built monuments to eternity, we begin to realize that the real conquest of Nubia was not through war, but through time. 4,000 of years after the fall of Meroë, the world forgot their names, but their legacy endured quietly in the architecture of belief, in the language of art, and in the rhythm of the Nile itself. Even now, in the world beyond history, their influence stirs imagination. In literature and film, in museums and classrooms, the story of Nubia inspires a new generation to look southward, to see Africa not as a background to other empires, but as the birthplace of brilliance itself. The faces of Nubian rulers, once hidden in museum basements, now stand proudly in exhibitions around the world. Their golden jewelry, their carved amulets, their thrones of sandstone remind us of a truth often overlooked, that civilization has many cradles and the Nile was home to more than one. Modern archaeology continues to bring these truths to light. Beneath the sands, more secrets wait to be found. More inscriptions, more temples, perhaps even new royal tombs. With each discovery, the narrative of history shifts slightly, correcting itself, expanding to include what was long forgotten. Nubia's story grows richer not because it changes, but because we are finally learning to listen. Imagine now that you are drifting above the Nile at twilight. The sky is painted in soft hues of violet and amber. Below, the water glimmers like a mirror of the heavens. You pass over ruins half buried in sand, over villages where children still play along the riverbanks, and over pyramids that have watched 100,000 sunsets. The air is still, the only sound the gentle pulse of the current. This is the same world that once belonged to the kings of Kush. You can almost hear their voices, carried faintly on the wind, not commanding but remembering. In this vision, the boundaries between past and present dissolve. The temples are no longer ruins, they glow with torchlight. The priests chant prayers to Ammonius, their voices rising in rhythm with the river's murmur. The queen stands at the threshold, her headdress gleaming in gold, her gaze steady as the horizon. The air is thick with incense, and the scent of myrrh and cedarwood mingles with the breath of the Nile. Somewhere in the distance, a lion roars, not in threat, but as a symbol of eternal strength. Time, like the river, moves in circles. The past returns not as repetition but as resonance. Every civilization, every human heart flows toward the same sea, a sea of memory. The story of Nubia is not a relic to be studied, but a rhythm to be felt. It reminds us that greatness can be quiet, that wisdom often speaks in whispers, and that beauty endures long after its makers have gone. As you rest now, let the story of the Nile cradle your thoughts. Let your breath follow the river's pace, slow, steady, eternal. Picture the golden sands, the soft glow of moonlight on stone, the distant hum of unseen life along the riverbanks. The kings and queens of Nubia sleep beneath those stars, their dreams mingling with yours. The river flows as it always has, carrying the memory of empires and the promise of new beginnings. And so the story continues, not in monuments or wars, but in the quiet persistence of life. The Nile keeps its secrets, the desert keeps its silence, and the human heart keeps its longing. Together, they form the true legacy of Nubia, an unbroken connection between earth and sky, between the living and the dead, between history and eternity. Rest now in that understanding. The eternal river flows beside you, its murmur soft as breath. The kings of old keep their vigil. The stars drift above, and time folds in upon itself like the gentle curl of a wave. The story of Nubia, the story of humanity, flows on, calm, endless, and serene. As the centuries unfold and the kingdoms of Nubia fade into the long horizon of time, silence begins to fall over the desert valleys. The temples grow quiet. The carved walls of stone that once caught the morning light now stand half buried in the drifting sands. The voices of the kings are gone, their names softened by erosion, their stories hidden beneath layers of earth. Yet even in this quiet, the land remembers. It holds secrets that will wait thousands of years before being gently awakened by new hands, by new eyes, and by minds searching to understand the great civilizations that came before. The story of Nubia's rediscovery begins not in the deserts of Africa, but in the curiosity of travelers and scholars far away, people who gazed upon the Nile and wondered what mysteries lay beyond Egypt's southern border. For centuries, the world knew little of the lands that stretched upriver, except through fragments of ancient records, Greek writings that spoke of gold, ivory, and dark-skinned kings who once ruled with immense wealth and wisdom. To most, Nubia was a shadow, a region glimpsed but not understood. That would slowly change in the 19th century, as explorers and archaeologists began to trace the forgotten path of the Nile, moving southward into lands long hidden from foreign eyes. The first wave of exploration came with the great European expeditions of the 1800s. These journeys were filled with hardship, with the endless sun, sandstorms, and the challenge of navigating a river whose cataracts could swallow boats whole. Yet driven by curiosity, men like Frederick Cailliaud, Giuseppe Ferlini, and Carl Richard Lepsius began mapping and documenting the sites they encountered. They saw towering stone pyramids at places like Meroë, structures smaller than those of Giza but more numerous, rising from the desert like a field of memory. For the first time in millennia, the pyramids of Nubia stood again before the gaze of the world. At Meroë, Ferlini, an Italian adventurer and treasure hunter, would do something both tragic and revealing. In 1834 he dynamited the top of several pyramids, searching for gold and artifacts. To his astonishment, he found treasure, jewels, amulets, and intricate gold ornaments of extraordinary craftsmanship. Though his methods destroyed much, his discovery proved beyond doubt that this region had once held a powerful and wealthy civilization. The relics he unearthed, now scattered in museums across Europe, became silent witnesses to the splendor of ancient Nubia. In time, archaeologists began to move away from treasure hunting toward more careful study. Karl Lepsius, sent by the Prussian king in the 1840s, recorded and sketched every temple and pyramid he could find between Aswan and Khartoum. His work was patient, methodical, and deeply respectful. He was one of the first to recognize that Nubia was not simply an extension of Egypt, but a distinct civilization with its own language, art, and royal lineage. His records, later published as Denkmäler aus Ägypten und Ethiopian, preserved invaluable details of monuments that even now, in the modern era, have eroded or vanished beneath rising waters. The rediscovery of Nubia came at a cost, however. As modernity advanced, so too did the transformation of the Nile itself. In the 20th century, the construction of the Aswan High Dam promised to harness the river's power, bringing electricity and irrigation to millions. But it also threatened to submerge entire regions of ancient Nubia under the waters of what would become Lake Nasser. Archaeologists faced a race against time. In the 1960s, an unprecedented international campaign began under the guidance of UNESCO. Teams from all over the world, Egyptian, Sudanese, Polish, American, German, joined forces to save as much of Nubia's heritage as possible before it disappeared beneath the flood. It was one of the greatest cooperative archaeological efforts in history. Temples like Abu Simbel, dedicated by Pharaoh Ramesses II and once watched over by the colossal seated statues of the king, were cut from solid rock and moved block by block to higher ground. Other temples, such as Philae and Amata, were dismantled, transported, and reassembled with extraordinary precision. Thousands of smaller artifacts, pottery, jewelry, steely tools, were catalogued and preserved. Yet many Nubian villages, ancient cemeteries, and unrecorded ruins were lost forever beneath the rising waters. The old valleys that had echoed with human life for thousands of years were drowned, their stories sealed away. But the effort to save Nubia's history did something profound. It drew the eyes of the world to a region long neglected. The Nubian people, who had always lived along these banks, were displaced from their ancestral homes, yet their culture endured. Their songs, languages, and oral traditions carried echoes of a heritage that stretched back to the ancient Kushite kings. Scholars began to see that Nubia was not just Egypt's neighbor or its shadow. It was a cradle of civilization in its own right, one that had shaped the course of African and world history. As modern archaeology advanced, so too did understanding. Excavations at Kerma, Napata, and Meroë revealed entire city plans, streets, workshops, royal palaces. Radiocarbon dating and linguistic studies began to trace the timeline of Nubian culture from prehistory to the medieval Christian kingdoms of Makuria and Alodia. The more that was uncovered, the clearer it became that Nubia had always been a crossroads, a place where African, Mediterranean, and Near Eastern cultures met, traded, and transformed one another. It was not a forgotten offshoot of Egypt, but an integral part of the human story of the Nile Valley. In museums across the world, the artifacts of Nubia began to speak softly once more. A gold pendant shaped like a ram's head, symbol of the god Ammonius. A fragment of a painted wall showing a queen in graceful profile, her jewelry gleaming in bright color. A stone relief of a king offering incense beneath the stars. Each object, small and silent, carries the weight of centuries, whispering of the lives that shaped them. For those who stand before them in quiet halls, the effect is almost meditative, an invitation to listen deeply to time itself. In recent decades, archaeologists have returned to Sudan and southern Egypt with new tools, ground-penetrating radar, 3D scanning, digital mapping. These technologies allow the sand to be peeled away virtually, revealing structures that remain buried. Discoveries continue: ancient fortresses, trade outposts, royal tombs still intact. Each new revelation deepens the sense that the story of Nubia is not finished. It is still unfolding, still speaking to us from the silence. And as this rediscovery continues, it brings with it reflection. Civilizations rise and fall, their cities turning to dust, their temples eroded by the wind. But knowledge endures. What was once hidden can be found again. The land itself, patient and enduring, keeps its memory. When we look into the face of a Nubian statue carved thousands of years ago with serene precision, we are looking into the mirror of humanity, its creativity, its ambition, and its longing to leave a mark upon the earth. The desert night deepens as we drift through this final stretch of Nubia's journey. The pyramids of Meroë glow faintly under the stars, their edges softened by time. Beyond them, the Nile moves quietly as it always has, carrying the reflections of moonlight and memory. The people who built these monuments are gone, yet their legacy flows still in the river, in the soil, and in the hearts of those who remember. As we close our eyes, the story of ancient Nubia settles gently in the mind. It becomes not just a tale of kings and empires, but a meditation on endurance, on the way time preserves even what seems lost. Beneath the sands, the thrones remain silent, but their presence is eternal, waiting for each new generation to listen once more.